The barracking started already.
Thank you all for your patience during that dramatic pause. My name is John Tates, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin this evening, I would like to acknowledge that McNally Robinson is located on Treaty 1 territory. That is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. You folks are all absolutely in for a treat. I'm delighted that you're all joining us here both live and online for a very special evening. I will do my best not to take up too much of your time as we have two fascinating individuals immediately to my left who have much more interesting things to say. We are here, of course, to hear from Ben Macintyre, author of many books, but most recently, Prisoners of the Castle, an epic story of survival and escape from Colditz, the Nazis' fortress prison. That is, of course, published by McClelland Stewart, an imprint of Penguin Random House, and we're very grateful to them for helping to make tonight happen. We're also enormously grateful to our friends at the Winnipeg International Writers Festival, and this event is taking place as part of Thin Air 2022. We're delighted to be partnering with them once again this year, and you'll be hearing a little bit more from Festival Director Charlene Deal immediately following tonight's event. Now, just to give you a sense of the procedure for the evening, there will be a conversation which will begin as soon as I've become quiet. And following that, there'll be an opportunity for all of you to ask questions. This applies to both you here physically and you online. So if you're watching on YouTube, write your question in the chat. If you're here, what I'm going to ask you to do is ask me the question, which I will then repeat into the microphone. This just ensures audibility both to those gathered here as well as those watching at home. I realize it is a little bit odd, but we do ask, because my brain capacity is rather limited, that you keep your question relatively succinct and ensure that it is a question. Rest assured, you will have ample opportunity to interrogate Mr. Macintyre when you get to the signing at the end of the event. Now, speaking of which, at the end of the event, we'll ask you all just to remain in place for one moment while we safely transport Ben Macintyre to the signing table, after which you'll be able to go over, purchase books, either pick them up at the table and get them signed, or visit the cash desk where we have copies of them available too. All we ask is that at some point this evening you do pay for the books that are in your hands. But now, this book is from the best-selling author of The Spy and the Traitor. It's a definitive and surprising new narrative of one of history's most infamous prisons and a remarkable cast of POWs who tried to relentlessly escape their Nazi captors. This is a book that, as I mentioned to Ben earlier, has been passed around from bookseller to bookseller here. It's a work of history that, which will not surprise any of Macintyre's readers, reads like an incredible and unbelievable novel. But it's one that not only manages to be steeped in incredible research and historical fact, but also serves as a great literary accomplishment. So we're particularly delighted for all those reasons. Macintyre is writer-at-large for the Times UK and the internationally best-selling author of 13 books, including Agent Sonia, The Spy and the Traitor, A Spy Among Friends, and Operation Mincemeat, which was the basis for a feature film starring Colin Firth and Matthew McFadden. Macintyre has also written and presented BBC documentaries of his work. We're delighted to have your host for this evening, the Saskatchewan-born Robert J. Young, who received his doctorate from the London School of Economics and is currently Emeritus Professor of History and Fellow of United College at the University of Winnipeg, the recipient of a university's Principal Award for Excellence in Teaching and its Principal Award for Excellence in Research. He was also named Canadian Professor of the Year by the Canadian Council for the Advancement of Education. The first of his 10 books was published by Harvard University Press, and his most recent, his debut novel, Another Spy for Paris, was published in 2018 by Signature Editions. Many of his books have won awards, including the Alexander Kennedy Isbister Award for Nonfiction at the Manitoba Book Awards. His second novel, Murder and Music in a Minor Key, will appear in 2023 with At Bay Press. Please join me in welcoming Robert J. Young and Ben Macintyre.
Thank you, John. Thank you, McNally Robinson. Thank you, Charlene Deal, the Winnipeg Writers Festival, for making this event possible. Thank all of you for being here. And thank you for being here. Ben and I have had a chance, 10 minutes in the dungeons back there, which I'd never visited before, to have a little conversation. So the book, as you all know, is called Prisoners of the Castle. That castle, of course, is Colditz in Saxony, close to Leipzig and Dresden. You write, Ben, the denizens of Colditz Castle over the centuries, in brackets, having been laid in the 11th century, have been many and varied, but almost all this in common, they were not there out of choice. The dowagers, lunatics, Jews, virgins, tubercular patients, war prisoners had all been brought to the castle by others and could not get out. That was particularly true of Allied soldiers of the Second World War. Numbered, by my reckoning at least, some 250 by December of 1944, and roughly 1,400 by April of 1945, which is a reflection of the way the war was going. Virtually all of these men had already demonstrated time and again sufficient determination and technical skill and resolve, premeditation, to escape from other prisoners of war camps. This was a real test to be sent to Colditz. This was the upper level, you know, you can't get better than that. And so they were sent. Not all of them were in that category, but many of them were certainly among the 200, the initial 200. And on the one hand, it was a challenge for these prisoners who had already escaped a number of times. And on the other, there was a challenge for the German Wehrmacht, because it was run by the army, not by the SS, to ensure that no one ever got out of Colditz. Now, just to let you know, for the record, what I have read at least, there were about 130 successful escapes from Colditz, that is to get out of the castle, but only about 32 who made it home, or at least made it into friendly hands. I'm wondering, Ben, if you could give us a visual sense of Colditz Castle, which you visited any number of times, I think, and you know the archivist and all of that, so please.
Yes, not only did I visit Colditz, I actually spent a large part of one summer living inside Colditz, because it is now, part of it is a youth hostel. I mean, everyone's got to spend their summer holidays somewhere, and I chose Colditz. It's an extraordinary place. It's a vast Gothic schloss on the edge of a cliff, looking down, dominating this quite small village below it. And it was always intended to be a symbol of domination. It was built by the electors of Saxony as a way of both incarcerating their enemies and relatives, and a way of kind of cowing the local population. So it always served a double purpose. But actually, as a choice of the Wehrmacht's plan to put all the worst behaved prisoners in one place, they were defined as Deutschfeindlich, which literally means, it's an untranslatable word, but it literally means German unfriendly. So Allied prisoners, and not just British ones. In fact, the Canadians were there before the British. When the British contingent first arrived, there were 4 Canadian pilots who were there before them, but they weren't just, as it were, of the British or Commonwealth armies. They were Poles, they were French, they were Dutch, they were Belgian. And so they were of all nations. And the idea from the Wehrmacht was if they could put them all together in one officers' camp, and crucially this was a camp for officers, not for general soldiers, that it would somehow be easier to control them. And of course, this was completely wrong, because if you put all the most recalcitrant people in one place, what they do is egg each other on. And very soon what you create, which is what they inadvertently created, was a kind of university for escapers. And so they all ended up sort of not only there was a rivalry between the different national groups to get out. and they had a sort of escape board, you know, and while the British were obviously delighted when the French got out, actually they were furious, you know, because there was this sort of intense rivalry among them. In fact, there were so many escapes going on at one point that there were something like 6 tunnels being dug simultaneously out of Colditz, and they were all quite literally undermining each other. So they of course, you know, they set up an international committee, as one would, and each nation had a sort of escape officer who would liaise with the other escape officers of different nationalities. And like most international arrangements, it kind of worked well until it didn't, or specifically until the British decided to walk out. It was a bit like the EU, really. So it was a fascinating sort of crucible, really, for sort of pre-war society. And also Colditz was a very bad place to try and build a high security prison, because while it looked terrifying, it's this vast Gothic thing with 700 rooms in it. It's huge. It's actually a very bad place to put a prison, because it was so old that it was full of holes. Almost literally. I mean, there were 5 different sewer systems running under Colditz, and there were lots of rooms that had been boarded up, and hidden staircases, and places to hide escape equipment, places to hide. That actually, really where you want to build a prison camp is in an enormous open space with a lot of barbed wire around it. So for those 2 reasons, it really wasn't ideal.
Thank you.
Sort of intro to it.
Another approach. Anyone who reads this book could not help but admire the ingenuity and the resolve, the technical capacity of so many of these Colditz prisoners. Whether that capacity and resolve was expressed in digging any number of tunnels, right? Or fabricating in a prison, fabricating German uniforms and faking official German documents. And as well, providing, on occasion at least, providing intelligence back home to whoever, home office, whatever, in secret code. I'm writing to my mother, but you know, here's the code. So British intelligence understands that. So it's amazing, the capacity of these individuals, their intelligence, their technical capacity is amazing. More troubling are the sustained patterns of racism and class division within the prison. Now, we're talking about the good guys here, right? The ones that are held in prison. But the example, there are several examples. One, the most notable one, I think, the East Indian medical doctor who's treated shamefully. He has British credentials. He actually is an Indian nationalist, except he swore allegiance to the crown. And he's in this place and he's badly treated. And another example would be the 2 Maori warriors in 45, who were also dismissed as not British, not sufficiently so, at least. So the racism is one, and the other, of course, is class division, where you have uniformed officers who are gentlemen, officers, gentlemen. And on the other hand, you have other British, particularly orderlies, not officers at all. They're the second class. And over again, you give us that sense. I'm sure it's not created by you. That's the way it was, this class division. Would you like to comment on either of those?
Well, let me take the sort of ingenuity aspect first, because it was astonishing the extent to which they would go. Let me just give you one example. The French built a tunnel, which they called Le Métro, which was 140 meters long. And it started in one of the towers in Colditz, in the watchtower. It went down through the sleeves that had been used to house the kind of clock mechanism. It then went through 2 cellars. It then went under the chapel floor. And then it ended up, just before it was betrayed by somebody within the French contingent. It was about 10 feet from the edge of the cliff face. And the French were planning a mass breakout from this thing. It had its own ventilation system. It had its own telephone system that operated inside the tunnel, so that if Germans were coming, they could warn the tunnelers to get out inside. It was an astonishing feat of engineering. Another one was they built a glider. They built an entire working glider in a false compartment in one of the attics. And the idea, this thing was made out of 600 individual pieces of wood, bits of metal from bed stands. It had a sort of catapult mechanism. The idea was that they were going to, at the moment of escape, they would build a runway on the apex of one of the roofs. And then with a kind of counterweight, which was a bath filled with cement, they would drop it off the end of the roof and hope to catapult this thing far enough that it would actually take off and then be able to glide across the river and land on the other side. It was never used because the war ended before it could be. But it was an absolutely amazing piece of engineering. And you talked about the disguises. I mean, there were really 2 ways to get escape. You needed escape equipment because getting out of Colditz was really difficult. But getting out of Germany, as Bob has just explained, was far harder because the nearest border into a neutral country was 400 miles away. So you needed to have money, you needed to have papers because everybody was checked for their papers all the time. You needed civilian clothes that looked convincing. And don't forget, these were officers who were captured in their uniforms and they wore uniforms, so you needed civilian clothes. You needed fake clothes. You needed either to disguise yourself as an officer or a German or whatever. So there were 2 ways of finding this stuff. One was to make it inside the castle. And they did become astonishingly adept at creating fake German passes carved out of linoleum, making medals that looked absolutely perfect, fabricating, sewing false uniforms that were almost indistinguishable from the real thing. So they could either try and make them inside the castle or they could try to smuggle them in. Now, because these were officers, under the Geneva Convention, they had the right to receive parcels from home. So regular parcel deliveries would arrive in Colditz from Britain, and these were frequently sent from charitable organizations, most of which were run by British intelligence. Because in fact, British intelligence, posing as it were as the Literary Society of Lewisham, was actually sending huge amounts of material into the castle. There were 2 problems with this. One is that the head of security at Colditz, and we might talk about him because he's a wonderful character, Reinhold Eggers, who was very clever and a sort of interesting man in many ways, worked out that the British particularly were smuggling huge amounts of contraband into the castle. And so he requisitioned an X-ray machine from the nearby hospital and began to X-ray every parcel that went through. What he didn't know, however, was the British and French had managed to pick the lock on the parcels office, which meant that they could get into the parcels office before the parcels were actually distributed and take out the contraband and the hidden stuff that was inside them, and then seal up the parcels so that by the time they were distributed and X-ray, there was nothing in them. But the great unsung hero of smuggling contraband into Colditz is a character I completely love, who wasn't a soldier and he wasn't a prisoner. His name was Christopher Clayton Hutton, known as Clutty. And he was an inventor. He was one of the models for Q in the James Bond stories. And Clutty was pretty much bonkers, but had this extraordinary talent for inventing escape gizmos. And he manufactured vast numbers of maps, for example, that could be smuggled in on tiny pieces of folded silk or mulberry leaves. He managed to hide hacksaw blades inside badminton handles and the parts for a radio transmitter inside hairbrushes. He would smuggle in money hidden inside gramophone records, escape passes concealed inside Monopoly sets. He was an extraordinary figure, and he even managed to work out how to hide a tiny compass inside a walnut. And there's a photograph of it in the book. And he's a different sort of warrior, if you like. I mean, I particularly love Clutty because while we're kind of used to the war of some guns and bombs and bullets, Clutty's a brilliant example of the fact that they also serve who work out how to hide a compass in a walnut. I mean, that is another way of fighting a war. But so that's in a way the sort of cheerier aspect of Colditz, this astonishing capacity to kind of, and a refusal to kind of give up, and the ingenuity and the resolve and so on. But of course, not everybody in Colditz was like that. And although that is the myth of Colditz, that particularly as a Brit, we inherited, we take in with our mother's milk, certainly if you were brought up in the 70s, that story was absolutely part of our national heritage. But actually, as Bob has alluded to, the real story of Colditz is both much more complicated and much darker than that. It is also a story about class and race and sexuality and boredom and depression and mental illness and treachery. I mean, there are whole areas of Colditz that have never really been discussed because they didn't fit into the mythology that we kind of grown up with. And so in a way, what I've tried to do with this book, without debunking the splendid story, it's a wonderful story about the escapes and the resolution, to try to give one a different perspective on the way humans behave in these very straitened and very, I mean, really stressful circumstances. I mean, Colditz was a terrible place in lots of ways, because being a prisoner of war is quite different from being a prisoner in a civilian prison. For one thing, everybody in there is by definition innocent. I mean, they have not committed any crime, and so there's a great sense of injustice that permeates every prison camp. And the other one is that unlike a normal prison, if you like, there was no end in sight. They were literally prisoners of the war, because they had no idea when the war was going to end. They couldn't tick off the passing days scrape them into the walls of the cells, because they had no idea when it was end. And so that lent kind of a sort of eternal feeling to being a prisoner of war. So in many ways, it was a very, very grim place, enlivened with moments of great adventure and absurdity. I mean, frequently it was hilarious.
They did theatrical productions, didn't they? I mean, they're amazingly creative.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, there was a new theatrical production roughly once every 3 days. And there was a Hawaiian band and an international orchestra and a French chamber group. And they had and because they were officers, instruments were provided to them. I mean, it's a fascinating thing. And the British, being British, of course, insisted on doing sort of pantomimes and absurd kind of, most of which seemed to involve lots and lots of cross-dressing. Again, it's a strange British obsession, but I found a wonderful photograph of a production called Ballet Nonsense, in which half the performers were these huge burly officers with moustaches dressed in tutus and brassieres, clumping across the stage. And of course, that went down a treat. It ran packed houses for 4 nights. So I can keep going endlessly. Perhaps I should just tell the story you alluded to, the Mazumdar story. Now, I think that's the Indian story of the Indian soldier. Just quickly do that, because it's a great example of how different the real story of Colditz is. So Birendranath Mazumdar was an Indian doctor, and he was the only non-white officer in the British contingent. And he was captured at Dunkirk. He was a man of high education. And a very clever, interesting person in many, many ways. But in Colditz, he was treated dreadfully, not by the Germans, as we said, but by his fellow British officers, who regarded him as a second-class citizen, wouldn't allow him to escape on the grounds that he was the wrong colour and so on. And he actually ended up, I mean, I'll cut a very long story short, but Mazumdar he was an Indian nationalist, and the Germans tried to recruit him as a propaganda tool, and he refused. And was sent back to Colditz, and was then regarded as a spy by the rest of the prisoners. So he went on hunger strike and insisted that he be moved, successfully in fact, moved to an all-Indian prison. There was one in France, from which he escaped. He amazingly, with another Indian soldier, he climbed over an 18-foot barbed wire fence and walked 500 miles across occupied France to the border with Switzerland, got across the border into Switzerland, joined the British contingent in neutral Switzerland, whereupon he was arrested because the British assumed he must be a spy. I mean, his story is extraordinary, and his widow is still alive, and I've had these astonishing conversations with her where we listened to these tapes that Mazumdar made before he died, and they're the most poignant things, really, because this is someone who was really prevented from telling their story on the grounds of racial prejudice.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. The time has come to get tougher.
You're right.
So according to my notes, by 2005, that's a long time ago, there were already 37 books on Colditz, specifically as a prisoner of war camp. Books in English, French, and German. Now, as you well know, historians typically try to make a case for having done something novel. New material, new interpretation.
Yeah, well, let me, lovely. So, yes, there are 35 books, and they are almost all the same book. They are almost all the ones up until 2005 written by upper middle class, English educated public school boys. And they tell an identical tale of a man with a moustache set on stiff upper lip who defeats the Germans by carrying on the war in a different sort of way. They follow, it's uncanny actually, how closely they follow an identical pattern. They don't tell a story of the women who are part of the Colditz story, or the homosexuality that was part of the Colditz story, or the darker side of mental illness that was absolutely central to Colditz. They don't even really go in, they certainly don't discuss Mazumdar and his escape. These subjects are excluded from the mythology of Colditz. And since 2005, a huge amount of new material has emerged on the Colditz subject, and it comes really from three different areas. One is that the Imperial War Museum in Britain, starting in about 1996, 94 actually, began collecting the oral testimony of every surviving prisoner that they could find from Colditz. And there is something like 1,500 hours of those recordings that have never really been used. And what makes them so special is that they are, this is the testimony of men who are now in advanced age. They're in their 70s or even 80s. And they feel free. It's fascinating to talk about the sorts of subjects that they could never have talked about in the 50s and 60s when the story of Colditz first emerged. Those very subjects, those very taboo subjects I was talking about earlier. And so, I mean, Mazumdar's tapes is one good example. Another amazing one are the tape recordings of a man called Alex Ross, who was an orderly. He was an ordinary soldier who was brought in as a servant. Okay, so he was a prisoner of war, but he was there to serve a senior officer. Yeah. And the officer in question was Douglas Bader, who was probably the most famous soldier in Colditz. But the way he describes his experience, it's absolutely fascinating. You can tell that he is unburdening himself of a story that he was not able to tell before. So I think that's one reason, that's one part of this vast amount of new material. The other one is that, I mean, I'm always stunned by this, and I don't know if you'd agree with this, Bob, but the Second World War was such a literate war. I'm not literary, but literate. It produced very few good works of literature, but everybody could write and read, including the ordinary soldiers. And I'm stunned by researching this book, how often I would contact the families of soldiers who had been in Colditz and ask them, you know, do you have anything? And so often they would say, oh yes, in the attic. You know, there's a box of postcards, or there are letters. I mean, you know, not in every case, but in a huge number of cases, there is material because everybody wrote everything down, and nobody had ever tried to gather it really. And I guess the final bit is declassified material, because the British government, again starting in the 90s, began to declassify intelligence material that had hitherto been totally secret, and that includes the records of MI9. Now, we all know about MI5 and MI6. I'm not quite sure about MI7 and 8, But MI9 was the organization of British intelligence that was coordinating escape attempts behind the lines. And all of that stuff was completely secret when the last book about Colditz in 2005 came out. So to answer your question, I'm amazed that nobody had done this before, because there's an absolute tsunami of far more than I could ever use, actually. I mean, one of the problems with writing this book was there was just such a wealth of material and such a breadth of different characters that I found myself sort of actually having to kind of dismiss quite a lot of it in order to keep the narrative going.
Excellent. Thank you for that. That really is very, very telling. I have a series of questions, as you would know. As long, this is a condition, as long as you include Douglas Bader, who are the people that you are most likely to remember forever? Just 2 or 3.
Okay, well, I mean, let me tell you about Douglas Bader, who was not just the most famous fighting soldier on the British, he was probably the most famous fighting soldier of the war, actually. And he was a fighter pilot. He had lost both his legs in a flying accident before the war, so he had 2 artificial legs. And but he managed to persuade the RAF to let him fight. And so he became a very successful Spitfire pilot. And it was also, it has to be said, a poster child for the whole war effort, because he was a great symbol of overcoming adversity, getting back in the plane, never saying die. The thing about Douglas Bader was that he was incredibly brave, but he was also a monster. But let me come back to that in a second.
So he was not humble.
He was not. He was a dreadful man. He was a kind of arrogant, brutal, snobbish. I'll come to why I think that in a second. So poor old Bader, I give him a pretty bad time in this book. But so Bader flew again and appeared in lots of newspapers. And then he was shot down over northern France. And as he was bailing out of his Spitfire, one of his prosthetic legs was caught under the joystick of the plane. So as his parachute inflated, the leather straps gave way and his leg was torn off. So he landed with one false leg. And then in an astonishing act of chivalry, the Germans contacted British intelligence and sent a message saying, Bader needs another leg. And so the British sent one over. They parachuted another false leg to Douglas Bader in an operation codenamed, brilliantly, Operation Leg. So this leg was duly floated down and reattached to Douglas Bader. So with 2 working legs, he immediately tried to escape and was immediately captured, because it's very hard to get away so he then tried to escape again, was recaptured, and then taken to Colditz, where he was accompanied by this batman, this ordinary soldier, this orderly called Alex Ross, whose jobs included carrying Bader up and down 3 flights of stairs for his baths, cooking his breakfast. Bader had special rations because he was sort of celebrated. Even the Germans were in awe of him. But those special foodstuffs never got anywhere near Alex Ross. He never saw any of them. And the worst episode, you'll remember this, Bob, was sort of about 2 years before the end of the war. Alex Ross, the orderly, was selected for a repatriation scheme. There was a system whereby ordinary soldiers, other ranks, never officers, but other ranks, could be swapped for their equivalent POWs in the West, in Britain and America. And Ross was selected, and so he went to see Douglas Bader and said, "I've got very good news, Wing Commander, I'm going home." And Douglas Bader said, "No, you're not." He said, "You're my lackey, and that's what you're here to do, and you will stay here until the day I'm released." And that is what happened to Alex Ross. He spent another 2.25 years in captivity because Douglas Bader needed somebody to carry him upstairs for his bath. I mean, it's a terrible story. And to us, it just seems sort of incomprehensible that someone like Ross wouldn't say, "Well, I'm going anyway." And Ross is very interesting in the tapes about this. He said the habits of obedience between the master and the servant, the officer and the other ranks, was so ingrained that he just didn't feel he could object. So Bader is a kind of both a towering figure in this book, but also as he was a complete hero and a total bastard. So that's why I'm fascinated by him. And the other one, much less, in fact, totally unknown actually, is the character of Julius Green. I don't know if you remember him. He was the Colditz dentist.
Yeah.
And he was a very good dentist, but he was also a spy. And he was responsible. He was a wandering dentist because the Germans used him and took him around the different prison camps. And he was gathering huge quantities of extremely valuable intelligence, troop displacements, armaments, morale, all the stuff that MI9 could then pass on to British intelligence that was incredibly useful. And he was sending it back in these coded letters. He was a Jewish doctor from Glasgow, and not at all an obvious warrior in any way, but I've seen his letters and they're wonderful because they read as if they're enormously boring letters to his family. But actually they're written in this very complex, I reproduced the code in the book, this complex alphabetical and numerical code that the Germans never broke. They never broke it. And it was used not just for the prisoners to convey information back to MI9, but for MI9 to communicate with the prisoners. So they could warn them, for example, when important consignments of escape equipment was arriving or special foodstuffs were on the way. And so there was this sort of spy network, and of course that's my particular fascination, this spy network operating inside the castle, which I loved. And Julius Green is a wonderful character because he never claimed to be brave. He always described himself as a coward. And he spent most of the wars with, he was a sort of gourmand, really. He spent his whole time dreaming up the meals he was going to eat when he finally got out.
One of the little shorter pieces, but there was a French officer. I want to say Louvre, but I'm not sure. He was one of the 30 that actually made it home. And then sent a note to Colditz, would you send my stuff?
And they did. But that's the bizarre thing, is he sent a note saying, thank you very much for having me. He was extremely well dressed, and he was very proud of his sort of kit that he had in Colditz, and they sent it back to honor, so he could sort of dress him. He was extraordinary, that character, because he also then tried at the end of the war, as part of the French resistance army, to liberate Colditz, more or less single-handedly. He tried to lead a tank division back to kind of get his friends out again, just in the closing chapter of the war. He was terrific. He was frightfully well dressed in that sort of French way. He sort of made himself a beautiful suit before he escaped.
Ben, you have been producing a major, I want all of you to get this because it's extraordinary, beautifully written, jargon-free, historical work, not fiction, at a rate of one every 2 or 3 years. Agent Sonia, just to give you some examples, in 2020, The Spy and the Traitor in 2018, SAS Rogue Heroes the year before, 2017. That one has generated a 6-part TV series.
This soon to be released. Yeah, no, that's coming out next month.
Okay, so it's 22, right? A Spy Among Friends, that's the Kim Philby story in 2014, followed by a 7-part TV series, also
due for release, yes, later this year. I mean, it's
and now
strange experience.
All this while working as a writer at large for the Times of London. Okay, so 2 questions this time. First,
embraced.
Could you give us an idea about your reading and writing regimen?
Well, I without being falsely modest, the truth is some of these stories are so exciting and the material is so abundant that they almost write themselves. That's not quite true of Colditz, because that took quite a lot of sort of finding. But The Spy and the Traitor, for example, that's the story of Oleg Gordievsky, who was an astonishing KGB double agent. That was such an exciting story that once I'd interviewed everybody who was involved, it sort of just came tumbling out. So I do write fast, and I think that's partly because I was trained as a journalist and I have no real fear of a blank page. I never have, and so I work very early in the morning and I tend to write until midday and then I stop and then I look at it again in the evenings. My sort of cycle at the moment is that I research for a year, and then I write for a year. And there comes this sort of terrible moment in the middle there where I have to force myself to stop researching and make myself sit down and write. But I suppose, and I'm flattered, they are history. I've never made anything up. I think that is one of the things that you have to be absolutely rigorous about with narrative nonfiction. The minute you start to speculate, the minute you start to say, this must have happened in a different part of the forest, or maybe they thought this, or maybe he dreamt that, you're writing a novel. That's a completely different thing. And I think, as a writer of history, there are moments when you run into problems, you run out of material. There just is, there's a gap. And I make it a sort of point of honor, really, that when that happens, I don't disguise it. I write in the book, we don't know what happened at this point. And I think if you do that and you're completely honest with the reader, then when you do say, you write, that room smelled of croissant that morning and, the sky was blue, you write it because you know it. You've got a source that can back you up on that. And I think there's a kind of pact you have with the reader, unspoken, unwritten, but sort of definitely there, that I'm telling a story and I'm telling it in a novelistic way. So I'm using cliffhangers, I'm enlivening events, I'm dropping things that bore me. I'm not trying to tell a scholarly tale, but I am telling a story, and it's a true story. And I've never yet, touch wood, been caught out. I mean, nobody. I mean, occasionally someone will pop up in the audience and say, "Well, how do you know that? How do you know she thought that?" Well, usually, always, because I've got a source. I've got a diary, or I've got a postcard, or I've got a letter. And as I say, because this period is so fertile, it's so full of information, and the intelligence files have been absolute gold dust for me. Like many of these books, I couldn't have written without the details.
But it takes hours and hours of reading and archives, and it does. I think you do acknowledge a research assistant. I can't remember his name.
Not really. I mean, I've been there, not for years. I found having an assistant, I've tried it a few times. It doesn't really work because I'm often looking for the unlikely element of a story, not the thing that you would find.
But if it were a single assistant, that would be impressive. But this seems to me to be incredible in terms of the amount of time that you would have to, and this is not just reading published works, memoirs, and so on. This is, and a lot of this is archival work, and that takes a long time. They turn the lights out.
Although it's getting easier, Bobby, I think you'll agree with me. I mean, lockdown was a very difficult time to be working in archives because, of course, you couldn't get into archives. It was. I mean, I struggled at times with Colditz, but I have to say the archivists were unbelievably helpful. They were digitizing stuff as fast as I could read it and sending it to me from the archives, and that was wonderful. And so yes, it is. But there's no greater pleasure than sitting in an archive and opening those files, and the smell comes off them, and you can think, God, you're actually holding history. And that's particularly true. I mean, you've worked in the intelligence archives, and they are particular files, these ones, because these are declassified intelligence files, which the British, as I say, started declassifying some years ago. And they have a particular feel, those files, because they're meant to be secret. They're never meant to be read by people like Bob or I. They're meant to be kept secret. They're written for a secret community. And so they are honest in a way that most government files are not. Most government files are written by people who know they're going to be read by posterity, and they're trying to give a particular spin on things. That's not true of intelligence files because they're not meant to be read by me. And so when it goes wrong and when it goes right, they actually write in the margins, hooray, we're getting there, or we're going to hell in a handcart here. And so you get the feel of real history that sort of almost literally bubbles off the page with some of these things.
I said there were two questions, and we both know time. Okay, and John's going to be bugging us before very long. So my second question is, will you tell us what's next? I promise that we won't divulge.
Of course not. I mean, what could possibly go wrong with that idea? The truth is, I don't really know at the moment, Bob. I mean, I've got various things in the pot that I'm sort of cooking. What I want to do, and I haven't quite landed this yet, is because of what is happening in the contemporary world, because of what's happening in Ukraine and Russia, I'd love to try and unpick that critical few years between 1989 and 1991, when the Russian state appeared to fall apart, although of course it didn't. And there are a series of fascinating intelligence stories going both ways from that period, when the normal rules of engagement are dissolving. And I hope, touch wood, I've found a narrative story that will allow me to explore that period, because it's just far enough away for the protagonists probably to be willing to talk about it, and possibly just far enough away for me to sort of blackmail MI5 into releasing the relevant files. They may not, but even so, that's the period I'm kind of interested in.
Thank you. And now we're both searching for John Taylor.
There he is, as if by magic, from a hidden tunnel.
Oh, fine.
Thank you both so very much. So just as a reminder, if you do have a question, please raise your hand, ask me the question, and I'll repeat it into this microphone so all can hear. If you're watching live online, just write it in the chat. Yes.
One of my favorite stories is The Spy Among Us. And what I would like to know is how those people worked as spies when they were totally consumed by alcohol by noon.
So one of this audience members' favorite stories is The Spy Among Us. And the question is, how did those people operate as spies when they were consumed by alcohol from midday on?
There is undoubtedly a link between alcohol and espionage. I mean, of the Cambridge Five, 4 were proper alcoholics and 1 was just a very heavy drinker. But I think it is quite interesting actually, because we imagine that alcohol kind of loosens tongues, that it makes you more voluble, it makes you less likely to kind of spill your secrets. And I know you're particularly talking about Kim Philby, who by the end of his life was absolutely pickled. But actually, my feeling is that alcohol sometimes has the reverse effect, that alcohol can put you, if you are an alcoholic, puts you into a separate world where you are actually sort of more defended against, you're sort of almost already living a double life, and you're sort of defended against reality. And I'm pretty sure that's how Kim Philby really used alcohol. He used it as a kind of extra defense. And certainly Guy Burgess, who was another of the Cambridge Five, I don't think, I mean, he was a raging alcoholic, but nobody believed that anybody that drunk could really be a spy. I mean, that sounds like an odd thing to say, but it was a sort of camouflage, because he was lurching around the Foreign Office, you know, falling down stairs and getting into fights and so on. And the whole idea that he could somehow be this kind of brilliant secret agent just didn't fit with this sort of terrible soak. It's interesting that one, A Spy Among Friends, has just been made into, they've just finished filming the TV series that is based on that, with Damian Lewis and Guy Pearce playing the 2 protagonists. So Guy Pearce plays Kim Philby and Damian Lewis, and they're both absolutely brilliant. But they brilliantly caught that atmosphere of boozy kind of conviviality that meant that really it was a sort of camouflage for both sides, really. They used alcohol that way, and I think it was partly an inheritance of the war. There was so much drink sloshing around in the war that it's sort of, I think a lot of people emerged from the war with a real problem.
Thank you.
Okay.
Ben, kind of contrast, compare the British prisoner of war camps compared to the German ones. There didn't seem to be an awful lot of escapes with the British. It's only one airman, in fact, that made it all the way home.
Yeah. So this is a question asking Ben to contrast the German and British prisoner of war camps, thus there didn't seem to be many people escaping from the British camps.
Well, that was partly because German prisoners tended to be shipped off to either America or Canada, from which it was astonishingly difficult to escape for obvious reasons. So that's the sort of rather prosaic answer. And of course, the prisoner of war camps in Europe were contiguous with land masses that were neutral territory. So there was a sort of border to aim for, if you like. But it's true that there was only one, as I know of it, one successful German escape, and even that didn't get very far. So I think it's probably a rather different mentality. The Germans imprisoned on the Isle of Wight in the UK, and there was an officer camp there, showed no inclination to escape. And that whole prison was actually bugged by MI5 as a way of gathering intelligence on what the kind of captured Nazis were feeling, and it produced a huge amount of intelligence. So I think it was really just a different cast of mind. And it's worth emphasizing that the camps, the prison camps, Colditz included, were operated by German soldiers. They were operated by the Wehrmacht. So they weren't death camps, they weren't concentration camps, they weren't administered by the SS, which didn't make them holiday camps by any stretch of the imagination. They were still brutal places, but they weren't places of routine torture and death. And I think it's worth remembering that. You could easily be killed escaping from Colditz, but because you'd be shot at if you were trying to get out and you didn't stop. But it wasn't a place of brutal torture. Although there was in Colditz, and this was one of the chilling discoveries I made during this, which no one has ever written about, there was another camp on the outskirts of Colditz, which was a Nazi slave labor camp, that where Hungarian Jews shipped off from Hungary were being worked to death, routinely worked to death. The life expectancy in that camp was 3 months, and hundreds of people perished there. And in a way, quite apart from the horror of that, was the discovery that the prisoners of Colditz had no idea.
Yeah.
The guards at Colditz, including the senior guards, said they had no idea, somewhat less plausibly. The inhabitants of Colditz town also claimed they knew nothing about this, which is not believable. That simply cannot be the case. They must have known what was going on because it was going on their doorsteps. They were watching the cattle trucks coming in and the bodies being taken out. But it's, that is what happens sometimes in history. I mean, we remember what we want to remember and we forget what we need to forget. And I think so sorry, that's a slightly roundabout answer to your question, but so there are very different sorts of camps even within Germany. One would not want to generalize on them.
This is a question about the recent television series Colditz. And, the older television series, I'm terribly sorry, and how that reflects the reality of the situation, if it did at all.
I grew up watching that television series in the 1970s. I mean, if you were sentient in the 1970s in Britain, it was required watching. 1/3 of the entire population watched it. It was the most successful television drama at that point that the BBC had ever made. And it was terrific. I mean, it was incredibly exciting, but it told this very traditional mythologized story. It was all about brave British officers confounding the foolish and sadistic Germans and winning the war by other means. And of course, it was part of a kind of, it wasn't propaganda exactly, but the books written about Colditz immediately after the war also painted this picture, and it's quite clear why. I mean, Britain had sacrificed a great deal during the war. The empire was falling apart. People needed to feel that it had been worthwhile. And so it on par with a lot of those black and white productions. It told a story that made the culture feel better about itself. And there's no shame in any of that. I mean, it's not, they weren't sort of fooling anybody, but it's a very partial story in both senses. And then subsequent to that, there were a couple of films made about Colditz, but it was very hard to shape the mythology. And interestingly, the television rights to this one have just been obtained by a company. And I think the idea is to tell the Colditz story again, so familiar to many of us, or we think it's familiar, but to tell it from different vantage points. So it is possible, one episode would be told from the point of view of the Germans, one might be told from the point of view of, the dramatic society, one from the point of view of the only Indian soldiers. So there's a way of kind of, in a way, I suppose it's not a very pretty word, but triangulating the story of Colditz to give us sort of a clearer picture. And just quickly while we're on that, we weren't talking about the German experience. I did want to try and use this book to to tell the German side, because the Germans had a story here too. And there's one particular character called Reinhold Eggers, who was the head, who ended up as the head of security in Colditz, who was a man of great civilization, really. He was highly intelligent. He'd been a schoolmaster before the war. He'd actually taught in Britain, in a public school in Britain, and he had a great affection for the British. And he tried to stick by the rules. He didn't, he wasn't somebody who was murdering prisoners. He would introduce spies. He did his best to to foil as many escapes as he could. But his story is tinged with tragedy, because he, at the end of the war, Colditz fell into East Germany. It was part of East Germany, so it was run by the Soviets effectively, and he was picked up by the NKVD, the predecessor of the KGB, and interrogated, because it was assumed that he must be a Nazi, which he wasn't. He'd never joined the Nazi party. And he spent 10 years in a Soviet prison camp. I mean, he was treated appallingly, far worse than any of the people who he had kind of guarded while in Colditz. So he's a way of telling another's perspective, I suppose. So that's the sort of, again, a long answer to your question. Thank you.
All right, so we had these two questions here, and then we'll move to the online question, and then we'll wind down the evening. So I'll come over to you first.
I had two very brief questions. The first one is, towards the end of the war, conditions in Germany were bluntly rotten. And for example, you didn't want to be an able-bodied person wandering around, or you get grabbed and put into the folkstorm. You're fighting with us. And was there messages going from MI9 towards the end of the war, where they were saying, look, stay put, it's maybe a better idea? The other thing, though, is this idea of focusing on escaping, or focusing on mental problems and mental issues. Is there parallels of that to our current situation with COVID, where like, we were stuck almost like not at our own accord? We were all stuck, having to be remote, having to do this. Were there parallels of that, of how you maintain your sanity?
Okay, so this is a two-part question. The first relates to basically conditions in Germany during the war were completely rotten, with able-bodied people being grabbed from the street and driven into places like the Volkssturm. Were there messages from MI9 that were sent along, perhaps just telling people to stay in place? The second question related to possible similarities between our current situation with COVID and the restrictions associated therein to the events described within the book.
Absolutely right, on both counts actually, because towards the end of the war, things were becoming very sinister indeed, and Hitler had passed a commando order, which ordered that anybody, any enemy combatant found behind the lines in civilian clothing was not to be tried, they were to be executed. And of course, naturally, it transformed from being a sort of game to get out of Colditz to being a matter of life and death, because up until that point, if you were captured as an officer trying to escape, you were simply shipped back to Colditz. You would be very unlikely to come to worse harm than that. That changes dramatically from the middle of the war. And yes, senior officers and MI9 never made a formal pronouncement, because I think they thought it would have been a way of demoralizing the POWs. But certainly within Colditz, the senior British officers began to discourage escape. Not that they really needed to, because prisoners could make their own actuarial calculations and work out this was no longer an easy way to survive. Yes, I mean, I wrote this book during lockdown. I was locked down when writing this book, and I went sort of stir crazy, and at times I thought I could grow my own moustache and dig my way out of my flat. But, and I don't want to exaggerate the comparison, because of course, there is a huge difference between being required to sit on your sofa and watch Netflix for a year and order and deliver it, and what was happening in Colditz. But yes, there is I do feel that there is, this book tries to ask a question about what you would do in circumstances not of your making, where your liberty has been completely curtailed, you don't know when the end is coming, you don't understand why this is happening to you, you can't do what you normally do. And obviously these are not comparable experiences, but I think we all discovered that we had to try and work out different ways to get through a very, very difficult, in some cases extremely lonely, no contact with our normal lives and so on, locked up often with people that we might have arguments with, so there are elements of it, I think, that are the same. I wouldn't want to exaggerate it, but I think many of us did feel sort of thrown onto a kind of, how do I get through the boredom of this? Do I read books? Do I watch television? Do I make, so I think there are comparisons, absolutely.
Could you just talk a bit about how the Germans have commemorated the site since the Second World War? And then also how your work might add to that commemoration, or what you would want them to add to it?
So this is a question about what the Germans have done to commemorate the site of Colditz. And as a second part to the question, what Ben feels or how he might hope that his work contributes to the same.
For many years, Colditz was in East Germany, and it really wasn't commemorated. I mean, it was not visited. It wasn't a story. It wasn't an experience that the Soviets or the communist government of the GDR wanted to commemorate in any way, really. And the castle became very decayed. It became, once again, a sort of mental institution. It became a sort of repository for the local factory. It became a hospital at one point, but nobody really knew what to do with it. And then with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the trickle of people visiting Colditz began to swell again. I mean, a few had got there during the Cold War, but actually it then became a flood. And there is now a little museum in Colditz, which is wonderful. I hope that, my hope is that would be expanded. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily encourage anybody to want to go and spend their holidays in Colditz. It's perfectly comfortable, but it is a place rife with ghosts. I mean, I was very lucky. I became very friendly with the archivist there. He was a wonderful person. The actual paper, that was the other element that I meant to say about sort of research material, is that Colditz itself contains a treasure trove of material, photographs and letters and diaries, because people sort of send it in. And she very kindly sort of more or less gave me not completely free reign of the castle, but I was allowed to sort of wander around it and sort of investigate different pieces of it. And it has a very peculiar atmosphere. I don't think it's ever going to be a Four Seasons, but it's and the Germans have the German government, the government of Saxony has done it up. It's now in very, and it's been repainted, so it's not this sort of grim grey thing on the horizon. It's now white, and it's less Dracula's castle than a sort of fairy castle now. But it's a strange place, but I do hope people go and visit it, because I think it asks a whole series of questions that are very interesting.
Thank you, Ben. And we'll close with this question from Michael online. Hello, Ben. You spoke of mental health. I'm wondering how the prisoners did manage to maintain a sense of hope to attempt escape as often as they did.
Yes, I think escape was part of a kind of a way of thinking their way outside the walls of the castle. I think the drama was another element. They were living in if you could put on, the importance of being earnest every so often, you could escape from the kind of boredom and control that you were under. Books, there were plenty of books in Colditz. Amazingly, again, under the Geneva Convention, they were provided with lots of reading matter. So I think escape was part of a sort of imaginative way of getting outside the castle. Actually, even the glider that I mentioned to you that had been built, in some ways, that was more of an imaginative enterprise than it was a real escape attempt. I think the senior British officers knew, and this was sort of getting towards the end of the war, I think they knew it wouldn't fly, really. I mean, I think there was a high probability that it would have crashed the minute it took off. I mean, the set of different things that had to go right for it to fly. But it was a way, I think, for a collective endeavor, and all of these people to work together, and for them to sort of imagine themselves figuratively flying outside the walls of the castle. So I think that was one of the ways that they managed to maintain their sanity. But many of them, and again, this is a hidden part of the Colditz story, many did not. I mean, many never recovered from the experience of Colditz. A number of soldiers inside the castle attempted to commit suicide. Some of the German guards killed themselves. They were also prisoners. I mean, the guards were as much, in a way, incarcerated in this place as anybody else. And it took its toll. And there's one particular character I wrote about called Frank Flynn, whose story is, I think, extremely moving, because one of the ways of getting out of Colditz was to feign insanity. I mean, if you were really badly injured, or you were demonstrably mentally unstable, I mean, really seriously, then you could be moved out. And Frank Flynn began to pretend that he was losing his mind. But the reality was that the gap between the pretense and the reality began to blur. And he did, in fact, go really, I mean, he lost his mind. And he really never recovered. He was a very fragile psychological character for the rest of his life. And again, he's one of these tapes that is so moving because, again, it's a subject that you wouldn't be allowed to discuss mental illness in 1950. It just wouldn't be something you'd talk about. And the honesty with which he talks about his own mental distress to the end of his life, and he's a man of 89 when he's talking about all these tapes. It's really, it's wonderful that he felt sort of, I think, liberated enough to be able to talk about what had happened to himself in his own emotional life.
Thank you so much, Ben. Thank you very much, both of you. I now encourage you, if either of you have any closing words you might like to offer, to please go ahead and do so, and then we'll invite Charlene Deal from the Writers' Festival to offer closing words.
I just would say thank you once again to those of you who are here, and to Ben. It's been delightful. We got along immediately. And you come from Cambridge.
I know. Oh, very odd. One of the Cambridge spies. Well, thank you for doing a brilliant job. I'm really grateful to you, and I've thoroughly enjoyed this evening. I suppose just I leave you with one thought, which is that, I mean, I grew up in Scotland playing the Colditz board game. Believe it or not, there was a game devised by one of the prison officers called Escape from Colditz, and that is what it is. It's like Risk, but in a big castle. It can go on for anything up to a week, as far as I remember, and it's great fun. And it's all about gathering enough rope in order to scale off the roof of the chapel, and can you dig a tunnel here, and will the Germans stop you? But it's fun, and it contains none of the other side of Colditz. There's none of the sexuality or the women or all the different things that happen in Colditz that made it, to me, a much more interesting story. It's a much more complicated story. And I guess what I hope is that it asks a question, which I hope that most of my books ask in different ways. And it's not a question that I could easily answer. And it's a question that is very difficult to answer unless you're in these circumstances. But the essential question of Colditz is, what would you do? Of these prisoners in the castle, which one would you have been? And I can't answer that question, but I hope some people reading the book might ask themselves. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
What an amazing evening. I can't believe that a whole hour has just flown by. I'm so grateful to both of you for bringing your energy and your curiosity, and your extraordinary wealth of information, but also this very deep curiosity about human nature and these questions about how do we live? How would we live in circumstances that we haven't encountered? I swear that if I had encountered books like this when I was in history class way back when, I would have studied it with more energy and pursued it with more energy. Instead, I kind of went toward the novels. But you know, it's possible when I retire that I might kind of turn into a huge history buff. I can see it happening. Would you please join me in thanking these two for just an extraordinary conversation? So as John said earlier, this is one of the events as part of Thin Air 2022, which is, we're at the halfway point now. So we still have several more events here, and we have a couple of other off-site events. Next week, we'll be gathering at the Rady Center for a really extraordinary memoir called Kiss the Red Stairs, The Holocaust Once Removed, by Marcia Lederman, who's a really fine arts journalist, culture journalist. And we have several more things happening here this week. I think the next one is Thursday. Anne Mann is going to be here. And oh boy, I didn't park all the dates and data in my head. So you will have to go to our website, which is thinairfestival.ca, and have a look and see what else is happening. We have a couple of things happening this weekend. Just as it flew into my head. We have a workshop, which I think may end up happening here. So if you're a writer, and are interested in being part of a workshop, that's happening. And then on Monday, Holiday Monday, we're doing a walk. along in the Churchill Park sort of area. So you'd be more than welcome to join us there. As I said, you can find this stuff on our website, thinairfestival.ca. And while you're there, you can actually prowl around in writer profiles for the 57, I think it is, writers that we are hosting this year. And most of them have submitted short recordings that they've done to talk about their books. So it's a really great, lively place, and you can go there any time of day or night. So if you're not a sleeper, or maybe you want something to do with your morning coffee, it's there and welcoming until October 18th. So I encourage you all to buy this book. And as John said, you do have to pay for it, which is kind of a drag. It's how they run it here. But before we have to make sure that we let Ben escape the space before the rest of us follow him. They're going to convey him, which always sounds like it's going to be much more interesting to watch than it has ever been so far. But I also wanted to take a pause to say, will you please also join me in just showing your gratitude for this extraordinary place. McNally Robinson Booksellers is like a hub of culture in the city, and I would never want to be without it. So thank you to John, and thank you to the folks who made this extraordinary place for us together. Thanks for coming. Thank you all for coming tonight, and we will watch Ben get conveyed over to the signing table, which is near the cash desk.